Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you very much to Jolt and the organizers of AUTHLIB for inviting us to talk about our work. Let's see if I can find it. All right, tiny, tiny print. Okay, so what we have to present today is actually kind of a transitional form. So we began with a comparison of Austria and Hungary, with in mind that we wanted to look at the ways in which the different positions of a far-right party, so FPÖ, the Freedom Party in Austria, and Fidesz, arguably far-right in Hungary, different positions in government might influence the different ways that they have to talk about politics. And this kind of serves as a tough test of the proposition that rhetoric affects policy because of very strong EU constraints on having, an independent foreign policy. And we also thought it was an interesting way of achieving a sort of a controlled comparison between two countries that are in a similar place in Europe, both affected by the migration crisis and had other similarities, but had a difference in the position of the far-right party in government. So we still have elements of this in our work. However, we've kind of broadened it out a bit to kind of look at a very interesting set of documents that hasn't really been explored too much so far by populist researchers, and that is national security strategy documents. So let me first begin. Okay, so both Mehmet and I are now in international relations departments. I have been a longtime scholar of foreign policy analysis, and there is traditionally has been less focus by the researchers on populism on the policy impacts of populism or nationalism in the international sphere, right? For the most part, people have been focused on domestic policy and domestic politics and polarization, right? So this is all very kind of comparative politics stuff. So we wanted to see, what kind of impact does this have on foreign policy? So a little bit about national security strategy documents. What these are is they first originated in the US with the 1988 Goldwater-Nichols Act that mandated that the president, but actually National Security Advisor, provide a document every so often that's submitted to Congress that outlines the grand strategy of the country. So in other words, the types of foreign policies they can be expected to follow, the policies that line up with their national interests. And so what this body of work would now, the NSSs have been issued every so often, about every 4 years in the US since the late 80s. But other countries have now gotten into the habit of issuing similar types of documents, and now there's something like 600 of them now in the database, so it's global, right? And this is foreign policy documents again. So this is quite interesting because we wanted to look at the ways in which populism and nationalism and the combination ethnopopulism shows up in these documents. Okay, so the way that I have been thinking about this is in the context of a concept called foreign policy revisionism. So revisionism is a long-held concept in international relations theory that's usually associated with challenger powers. So you have these status quo powers, that kind of are supporting the status quo kind of system, now these days a liberal international order, and then you have these challenger powers that have traditionally been understood as these days China and Russia. So then there's this power transition theory that was coined by Urgonsky and Kugler to basically say, you have this transition in hegemonic power when the challenger powers get to be as strong as the status quo powers, and this leads to international conflict, right? But the way that I've been thinking about it is revisionism is really just a status correction that is pursued by a state, it doesn't need to be necessarily a challenger power. It can also be a status quo power. And that's one way that we have of thinking about the US right now, right? They're doing all kinds of revisionist policies, despite the fact that they are still, you know, the unparalleled power in the international system. Okay. So I'm not going to go into all of these, but I think we can all collectively agree that we've seen a lot of foreign policy revisionism, both laterally on the borders of states, so more to border conflicts, more conflicts with neighbors, right, which I think is associated with nationalism, and also a lot more revisionism at the systemic level, right, where you have I think yesterday we learned that the US is pulling out of 66 international organizations, right, but this follows a whole series of, you know, pulling back or exiting international organizations. And the combination, what I call omni-revisionism, is where you have revisionism on the borders, maybe with immigration controls, maybe border conflicts, as well as systemic revisionism, so pulling out of these international organizations or fighting with international bodies like the conflicts between Hungary and Poland traditionally and the EU. Okay, so I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but just to say that these are the ways that we're defining populism, nationalism, and the combination ethnopopulism, which is essentially kind of exclusionary sovereigntist frames to shrink the authentic imagined sovereign community. For populism, it's shrinking it down, making it closer to the people, getting rid of elites. For nationalism, it's shrinking it horizontally, getting rid of national others, migrants, and so on, right? The combination is these kind of small sovereignties where you're fighting against both elites and these national others that that are often argued to be working in concert, sort of like a fifth columnist sort of effort between elites and migrants, right? We saw this with a lot of the Soros, accusations that he was trying to, resettle migrants into Hungary and therefore dilute the national identity of the country. Okay, I'm not going to go into this, but you can see this is a kind of like a mobilizational, movement-based understanding that is neither supply side nor strictly demand side, but actually has leaders and the masses and ideas all working in concert in a particular kind of way. Oh, I'm going to turn the time over to Mehmet.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'll be brief with some things, so in case something is not clear, please feel free to ask later. So we have a two-step design. In the first step, we basically map these concepts that we talked about, ethnopopulism, populism, and nationalism, but also spheres of influence, which we find related at the national security strategy documents. So we map prevalence of these ideologies, in a way, in national security strategy documents, and we use pretty much the population of all national security strategy documents available. We built on Andrew Neil's data set from Glasgow University, but then we also add some of the recent ones that they don't have. I'll talk about the model specifically in the next slide, but I mean, normally I'm a big fan of word embeddings, as in the other paper I'm part of we use, but when we are working with legalistic documents where it's really hard to find prevalence of words that would be relevant, using large language models, I think, becomes the only option. So we use transformer-based language models, specifically sentence embeddings, because each part of these documents tend to have different arguments. So it made sense to divide them into chunks and then scale them. And in the second part, as Erin said, we focus on Hungary-Austria comparison, and it's a most similar system design in a way, but it differs that the far right, FPÖ, is the junior coalition, or was the junior coalition partner in Austria, and we look at its spillover effects on ÖVP, the senior coalition partner in a way. And in this case, we use a combination of what we So in the other paper, the globe word embeddings with the a la carte embeddings, which uses globe data as pre-training. And in the second part, we have both qualitative data and also parliamentary speeches. So to scale the documents, we have some anchor sentences that are synthetical. And normally we have around 10 each, but I'll show you some. Basically, we created this synthetic sentences and looked at actual sentences distance, cosine similarity, so how similar these sentences are to these other sentences in the embedding space using a sentence bird model. So for populism, for example, we have the typical elite people distinction-based rhetoric. In ethnopopulism, we have a nativized version of it, but also the fifth columnist one. So if you look at the second example there, globalist elites prioritize outsiders while ordinary native people pay the price. And in the nationalism, we have just the national in-group, out-group distinction. And again, all these sentences are synthetical. And in the spheres of influence part, we have basically this near abroad rhetoric. So first, the semantic validity of models. These are the sentence, by the way, here, we compare all these in a relative way. We compare to the liberal benchmark. So we also have some liberal sentences that are again synthetical, and we look at if the basically normalized cosine similarity based on how closer they are to populism, let's say, relative to liberalism. And these are the typical sentences, so the ones that had the highest cosine similarity. With ethnopopulism, we have the recent USA 2025 document, for example. They lashed the American foreign policy to a network of international institutions. It is there. And for populism, we have, for example, Gambia, where this was classified as highly populist. So security was designed to protect the interest of colonial elite. For nationalism, we have, for example, a discourse from Bolivia that mentions survival of nation. And for sphere of influence, we have Australia, for example, where they talk about their influence in near abroad and the sea and the air. So this shows that our model, despite very little effort, so it just needed, we just needed a free tire GPU to train this, is highly valid semantically. It also has convergent validity in the sense that different models we chose are highly correlated. So it's very likely that their downstream effects are non-consequential. So this is basic description of data over time. So what you see here in all these discourses is there was a sort of the peak is in the pre-Cold War, pre-end of Cold War, during the Cold War, and then it rises again in the last 3-4 years. Actually, when we put this into a time series model and control for country, there is an increase over time. So all these discourses became more relevant over time in national security strategy documents. And then we also analyzed this with a regression, with basically region fixed effects, year fixed effects, and document type fixed effects. And basically what we find is countries that are larger are more likely to use sphere of influence and nationalism rhetoric, and this is very robust. And countries that are less democratic, so we use the VDEM data electoral democracy index, they are more likely to use ethnopopulist and populist rhetoric. I'm not going to get into the case study so much. Just one example from here. You see that Hungarian discourse actually radicalized over time. So in 2012, there was still emphasis on sovereignty, but in a way that was collaborative with NATO and European Union, where in 2020, EU is framed as an alliance and a federation. Alliance, as an alliance. And then, in the parliamentary data, what we see is that basically, in Austria, in ÖVP MP speeches, there is some radicalization, but it's not as consistent as Fidesz MPs, which sort of supports our point that position of the far right matters there. With that, I'll conclude. Basically, we see an increase of nationalist, populist, and their combination ethno-populist framing over time. So there are both exogenous factors like country size and more endogenous factors like level of democracy. And case study shows that both liberal and illiberal parties might use this rhetoric, but their degree might differ. With that, we thank you very much.